Good morning, everybody. My name is Karolina Wigura, and I am the member of the board of Kultura Liberalna Foundation based in Warsaw. And I have the pleasure to chair yet another seminar of the whole series of the Warsaw European Forum, which is organized jointly by Kultura Liberalna together with the Foundation for Polish-German Cooperation, with the Foundation Friedort Ort and with the Zeit Foundation. So welcome everybody, and I would now like very briefly to introduce our speakers of today, and we will very briefly and very soon begin the seminar, which is today devoted to the long-term consequences of the war in Ukraine for Russia, for Ukraine, and for Belarus. This is very important for us because we have started this series in March already, March 22, believing that in the times of news, when we are dominated with news, we have to think also in at least middle term and, if possible, also long term categories. So this is one of those seminars, there's a whole series of seminars. And if you would like to see the seminars from the past weeks and the past months, please do visit our channel, the Kultura Liberalna's channel at YouTube, but also please do visit our website, warsaweuropeanforum.com, and there you can find all the events that we have already organized for you. Now, today we are joined by very distinguished speakers. I will now ask them to take the floor in alphabetical order. So the first will be Konstanty Gebert, who is a journalist, formerly with the Warsaw Daily Gazeta Wyborcza, and now with the internet weekly Kultura Liberalna in Warsaw. We also have with us Professor Klaus Offe, who is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Hertie School of Government and Professor Emeritus at Humboldt University in Berlin. We will be also hearing remarks from Yevgeny Hlibovitsky, who is a Ukrainian public intellectual and a founder of Promova, a think tank and a consultancy. And last but not least, we are joined by Christine Ockrent, a journalist, columnist and writer based in Paris, also very active in the radio France Culture. We start with Konstanty, and please, Konstanty, take the floor.
Thank you. While completely agreeing that it's necessary to think in the medium and long term, we'll have to say that doing that without knowing what we're thinking about is, of course, an impossible task. And as long as the outcome of the war in Ukraine remains unclear, our thinking must be necessarily marked by the fact that depending on what happens, the medium and the long term might look very differently. If Russia suffers a substantial defeat, the perspective changes, but it also changes if Russia doesn't suffer such a defeat. So at the end of the day, we are left with juggling probabilities. And this necessarily means that much of our predictions will have to turn incorrect. Some things, however, seem reasonably clear already. One is that Russia will not win the war. It will not achieve the war aims that set to itself. And Russian authorities have already as good as admitted to that. Now, what this means that whatever the nature of the outcome, Russia will be left frustrated and will be analyzing the reasons of its failure, of its lack of success, in reaching the goals it had set itself. And there is a strong probability that this will develop into a kind of Weimar syndrome. Why have we had to concede defeat? if we were winning, right? Therefore, it will be very easy for Russia to claim treason, betrayal, a knife in the back. This will probably entail looking for domestic traitors, but also will strengthen the vision of the world as a hostile place, anti-Russian by definition, and that Russia needs to defend itself from, probably preemptively by attacking to counter an expected attack. What this would mean is a Russia that is inherently unstable and insecure, with demands that have not been met, expectations that have been deceived. And we know from history that Weimar powers are dangerous and threatening to live next door with. We have never yet seen a nuclear-armed Weimar power. And this obviously is the apocalyptic dimension that we prefer not even to think of, but which is present in any conceivable future. It is also clear that Ukraine will not be defeated. The extent of a Ukrainian victory is highly debatable. And Zelensky yesterday conceded that Ukraine will not be able to recover all the territories that have been taken by Russia from 2014 onwards. But still, it will be very difficult to deny that Ukraine has been spectacularly successful beyond expectations, and that success is mainly due to an unexpected stamina, determination, and will to fight of the Ukrainian people. Now, this would have come to naught if not for the massive support that Ukraine eventually received from the outside. But without Ukrainian determination and will to fight, that support would not have counted. So what we will have in Ukraine is something similar and yet fundamentally different from what I think we'll have to in Russia. There will be the frustration of an incomplete victory. And I think that the take that Ukraine will take on it will be blaming its allies. We did our utmost, the Ukrainians will say, but if we were unable to completely defeat the Russians, it is because the support we got from the outside was insufficient. And there is a very strong risk that Ukraine will adopt in its post-war relations with the world a kind of holier-than-thou attitude. We did what we were supposed to do. You failed us. No matter whatever you did, it really wasn't enough. Otherwise, we would have won. And this, of course, creates a very unstable and unsatisfactory basis for a relationship. Furthermore, this war is really constitutive of the modern political Ukrainian nation. It has created a unifying experience. It is clearly an experience of mass participation, and therefore the new Ukraine that will emerge from the war will probably be very different from the Ukraine we have known so far. This means a number of fundamental questions. One is, who will be the models, human role models, political models for this future Ukraine? The first group will be, of course, heroes of the war. And among the heroes of the war, certainly the heroic defendants of Mariupol, the Azov Regiment, which sadly includes also extreme rightist and neo-Nazi elements, which is really very difficult to criticize after the war, precisely because these are the heroes that made a Ukrainian victory possible. President Zelensky has been catapulted into the stratosphere by his excellent political rhetoric and his fundamentally successful way of pressuring allies into supporting Ukraine. But his public support before the war was in the 20s, 23 or 24, if I remember. And it is unclear if his realistic political power base has expanded. One possibility, therefore, is that victorious Ukraine will see an internal political power struggle, which might seriously undermine the authority of the authorities such as have emerged from the war. And to add to this confusion, Belarus, which suddenly has become a sideshow, Belarus, which was really the front line of the struggle for democracy in our part of the world, and which has been relegated to a secondary issue, mainly of tactical importance as a background, a hinterland for the Russian army. But it is very obvious by now that Lukashenko's regime survives not only through the strength of its own internal repression, but through the strength of the Russian support it receives. And in those scenarios, it is doubtful whether Russia will be able to extend this kind of support and whether it will be effective even if extended. So a downfall of Lukashenko seems quite plausible. And at that point, all odds are open. It might be a Belarusian Maidan leading to the setting of an independent and democratic country, or it might mean that Lukashenko has been successful in what he has been doing, which is destroying the newly emergent democratic elites, and Belarus will be left to settle itself without the kind of strong foundation that democracy found in Ukraine after Maidan, without anybody paying much attention because the big action will be elsewhere. Now, as I said, all those predictions can prove to be entirely false if one element is off and the situation develops in a different way. But as I said, we are juggling probabilities, and that's probably the best we can do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Constante. And at the same time, I would like to point out that what you have been arguing, what you have been stressing is the trends, so the possible trends. But I would like to ask you one additional question about concerning these trends. Namely, when you say Russia, do you mean Putin's Russia, or do you mean Russia in general? Because when you compare Russia to a Weimar-like state, then I think, well, it might be interpreted in various ways. You might say that the frustration would never be realized in such a horrible way in Germany. Was it not for Adolf Hitler? So, do you think that the trends that you have been mentioning are interdependent with the concrete persons that are at power in Russia, but also in Ukraine and also in Belarus?
Well, that's the $64,000 question, isn't it? The real question is, when you ask me, do I mean Russia in general or Putin's Russia? Well, the question to that question is, how much of a difference is there? What does seem evident is that Putin has been highly successful in crushing all alternatives to Putin's Russia, which means that unless something fundamentally changes, Putin's successor is likely to be exactly that, Putin's successor, Putin Mark II. And in that perspective, we will be faced with different variants of Putin's Russia. Now, this might be completely untrue. I really venture that we don't know and don't understand what's happening deep in Russia, in Russian civil society. But an alternative to Putin would have to be so destructive to the existing Russian state structure that it would come close to being a revolution with unpredictable consequences. And the Weimar analogy, I think, is valid because Weimar did not have to end with Hitler. The teleological perspective that, well, the crisis and the weakness of democracy fatally have to produce fascism is simply false. It's relatively easy to imagine alternative scenarios in which Hitler does not take power in 1933. Maybe he would need some more years, maybe an alternative course would be found. History is not predetermined. And this is the only hope I have when I think about a possible non-Putin Russia.
Thank you so much. A warm thank you, Konstanty Gebert, for your introductory remarks. And I will stick to the alphabetical order now. And I will now kindly ask Klaus Offe to take the floor.
Okay, we are supposed to talk about long-term consequences. These are the future. The future is unknowable. We need to stay away from wishful thinking. The best we can accomplish is some thoughtful wishing and responsible guessing. Commentators and Western political elites agree that the military situation is entirely open, and that is contrary to what Putin may have anticipated. Even if Russia were to win the war, the Ukraine and its people will be entirely ungovernable by an occupational regime. Even gaining military control is very different from maintaining a post-war civil regime. Even if Russia wins the military conflict, such victory will be extremely costly to the Russians in both political and economic terms. Russia will be exposed as being a pariah state for a long time to come. Control of internal opposition will require even greater doses of repression. Economic sanctions will have long-term and painful effects. A massive loss of professionals, artists, skilled workers through outward migration is widely anticipated. The war and its atrocities and future memories thereof will strengthen an irreversible Ukrainian process of nation building and the consolidation of Ukrainian nationhood. All of these self-inflicted damaging consequences of the aggressive invasion could easily have been anticipated by Russians. Future historians will have to solve the extreme puzzle of the gross irrationality of starting the war. One possible answer may have to do with the personalistic, and some people say neo-Stalinist Russian power structure, where power is equivalent to a license not to learn or not to engage in the appreciation of realities. Another answer may have to do with the intoxication of Russian leaders with the ethno-nationalist reading of their own history. Much of the future course of events will be determined by the action of Western stakeholders, that is, the EU, NATO, and the member states. and the US, of course. They are not just providers of sanctions and military resources. It depends on Putin how he defines the situation, and from when on he perceives Western actors as combatants, and by what steps of escalation he is prepared to respond to such perception. Due to their significant role in the conflict, Western actors have clearly begun to claim a role in the process that leads to an armistice, a peace settlements, and eventually a long process of rebuilding Ukraine. They are Western actors are in the semi-public process of forming their own goals and shaping the way into the future of Ukraine. US Defense Secretary Austin has spoken of the goal of a permanent military incapacitation of the Russian military. And Kissinger has just advocated territorial concessions to be made that differ sharply from the stated goals of Ukrainian leaders. We get the emerging contours of a paternalistic and conditionalist regime whereby Western governments and supranational bodies try to impose their vision of the future of Ukraine upon the country. Paternalism means an attitude that says basically, I know better what is good for you than you do yourself. This paternalism is likely to be a dominant element in the situation. So we have a triangular conflict between Ukraine, Russia, and Western forces trying to intervene, impose, or as Kissinger just did. Even at the level of the Ukrainian government, there is a multiplicity of stated goals of military and diplomatic efforts. After a negotiated armistice, the invader forces must leave the country. That is obvious. But what are the territories that must be restored or given up in a peace treaty? Is the territory of internationally recognized Ukrainian sovereignty that which is currently controlled by the government, that controlled pre-February 22, or that controlled pre-2014, that is, including Donbass and Crimea. Anyway, how much territorial integrity is a prerequisite, a precondition of effective sovereignty, or an open question. Are compensation for the vast damages of infrastructure, residential buildings, government buildings, etc., to be granted by a settlement? Can war crimes be prosecuted, and by whom? How and by whom can the future repetition of such aggression be prevented and reliably and credibly prevented? How can the return of forcibly deported persons be accomplished? And most importantly, can any of all these obvious goals achieved and demands granted in the absence of a Russian regime change that virtually nobody so far has dared to predict or to envision? The answer to all of these questions will depend to a large extent on the future events and developments on the battlefields, and are thus absolutely uncertain as these. Long-term consequences are impossible to figure out with any degree of certainty. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Klaus. We thank Klaus Offe for those introductory remarks. And I would like now to straight turn to Yevgeny Khybovitsky and ask you to take the floor, please, Yevgeny.
Thank you very much. I would like to outline a few things that become visible from Ukraine, from the Ukrainian perspective, but also the things that respond in a way to what's been mentioned already today. First, from the Ukrainian perspective, this is not a single war, but a war that has many dimensions. And it's important that we address these different dimensions. One dimension is a colonial dimension. Basically, Ukraine has had a long pregnancy from the moment when independence was proclaimed in 1991 until the moment when it was fulfilled in 2014. Just as Ukraine has became de facto independent, Ukraine has gotten its independence war with Russia seizing Crimea and bringing its forces to Donbass. So this is an independence war from the former metropole. And in that sense, this is the important dimension, because this dimension is usually not seen by mainstream Western observers, as Russia is not necessarily seen as an empire. Empire in the Western perception rather has a seaside to it. Russia is a unique empire, and I will step here for a moment into something that a missing Vladislav Inozemtsev would probably talk about. Russia is a unique empire that at the same time colonizes not only the others, but also its own people. And it colonizes not the territories that are far overseas, but the territories that are actually nearby. And the Russian rhetoric that refers to the near abroad underlines it exactly. Also, the other dimension of this war is the war of freedom and democracy, respect for human rights versus fascism. And as Timothy Snyder has brilliantly put it in his article in the New York Times, but also I would refer to other scholars who have been engaged in debate for a long time, like Alexander Motyl from Rutgers University or Anton Chekhovtsov. I think everyone in this debate is right now on the same page that it is one of the state of one of the fascist kinds. But also there is a third dimension to this war, and this is a war for resources. And we see clearly that the Russian advance in Kherson was not necessarily about taking something that is culturally Russian. Kherson is probably the most Ukrainian part of the Ukrainian South. But this is a clearly war for water. And we've been talking about these climatic wars for probably a couple of decades by now. Well, here's one. And it's important that we understand these different dimensions and that we address these different dimensions, because if we address them, if we take this war not broadly but narrowly, we may actually miss important part of the rationale behind the actions of the actors. The victory for Russia would mean the change of the world order and long-standing crisis for the West. This is something that not everyone in the West sees. I would say that in the European countries, in many European countries, both in the societies, but also in the political elites, we see the effects of poisoning by access security. Because security was provided and because security was paid by a third party, and 3 generations of Europeans have had very partial effort into sustaining this security, what we see is commoditization of security, and many Europeans don't feel that they actually have to make an input. And if we ask if I exaggerate and I ask the question, what if Russia attacks Germany, or what if Russia attacks France, or what if Russia attacks any other European country? Would the societies there be able to mobilize, or would they just give in? What would be the grassroots response? And I'm not talking about institutional response at this point, because this shows us the dynamic inside the Western societies. The frozen conflict would definitely be in Russia's interest. That would allow Russia actually to regroup itself. We've seen Russian system as extremely inefficient. It's incredible that Russian state was so corrupt. It's incredible that Russian state was so unmodern, and that allows Ukraine to fight off successfully against Russia. And in that sense, if Russia doesn't go through ethical change, and if Russia doesn't go through change of rethinking its history, but instead elects someone like, for instance, Mr. Navalny, what we will get is we will get the same imperialist Russia, but in a more efficient form, and in a form that is more likable by the West, which in my opinion is at least is not least dangerous than Putin himself. So actually what can come after Putin may actually be more dangerous than Putin himself. The victory of Ukraine will probably mean a collapse of Russian empire, which means more turbulence, and which means more difficulties on the Ukraine's border. So that basically puts Ukraine in a position of a frontier state. Ukraine will have to live with this regardless of the situation west of Ukraine. So that means that Ukrainian society will have to be militarized. Ukrainian society will have to learn with different kinds of dangers through longer periods of time. We're probably talking about generations. Need for uncomfortable reforms in the West in case of Russian collapse, and possibly deterrence for China will be more obvious. Russia's defeat is also the best scenario for the freedom of the Russian citizens, and that's also important to understand, even though the citizens right now are not acting as actors. One of the things that you see clearly among the Russian liberal voices that can be heard is that they do not want to take responsibility for what's happening in their country. Instead, they're actually asking not to push themselves into this responsibility. Another issue that should be talked about, and I think it's a defining issue long term, is demography. Demography will have strategic importance for any long-term consequences. On top of demographic transition, Russia and Ukraine are in post-traumatic demographic decline. Both Russia and Ukraine have record low birth rate numbers, and part of this is not because of urbanization or other usual reasons why demography is in such decline, but in Ukraine and in Russia, we have this historical trauma that contributes to demographic decline. For Ukraine, victory is a way to go out of this demographic decline into a post-traumatic growth. For Russia, it's a good question what can be a way out for Russia, what can be allowing Russia to improve its demography. One thing that we see right now clearly is that Russia is actually trying to steal as many people as it can. And what we see right now is that Russia is dispersing the Ukrainian citizens that it's actually taken outside of Ukraine throughout entire territory of its country, including distant areas like Sakhalin or Vladivostok or Khabarovsk. independence war against Russia is only a first of series of existential threats to Ukraine. It has narrowed the Ukrainian political agenda to essential issues. So future political competition in Ukraine is likely to be less about policy and more about policy implementation, making policy succession more probable. So one of the things that we see with this war is that it potentially can heal Ukrainian political arena, unless it gets poisoned by personal standoffs. And we see these personal standoffs between Zelensky and Poroshenko. We can also project that these standoffs may have other examples in the future. One of the things that is not communicated, but one of the things that we see clearly in Ukraine is that the nature of Ukrainian government is populist. And that makes Ukraine one of the countries that are part of this populist wave across the Western world. That gives some advantages and it puts some limitations on the Ukrainian political scene. The other issue that I think is important here is that security, I think this war has proven that security comes before development. And I think we are making a huge mistake in Euro integration of Ukraine right now, because we put EU before NATO. EU is not the way to deter a threat, including existential threat. Yes, EU helps the country to recover. It helps the country to reform itself. But we're at this point talking about survival, and NATO is more important for Ukraine than EU membership. We can have successful Ukraine beyond the EU, but I'm afraid we cannot have sustainable Ukrainian independence if Ukraine is not part of NATO. This is not the last, the Russian-Ukrainian war is not the last war, or is not the last security threat that we will have in the 21st century. So it's paramount that Ukraine, especially Ukraine that is contributing, especially Ukraine that can bring unique competences to the table, is part of NATO. And I am very sorry that this view is not shared inside the EU and across the Atlantic. Actually, what we see is, for the first time, we see since probably 2016, two successive US administrations that do not view Ukraine's NATO membership as essential. And the last thing is that Ukraine probably currently has the greatest soft power in the world. It will challenge not only dictatorships in the East, but also their democratic enablers in the West. And in that sense, Ukraine's multi-million migration just extends this soft power influence. Ukraine is likely to be a politically uncomfortable EU member for the policy preferences of the currently leading states. And I will make a stop here and then be able to contribute more later.
Thank you so very much, Yevgeny. And if I may just ask two brief follow-up questions here. First, you have told us about many layers of this war, many meanings of this war, but I would also like you to reflect for a tiny moment about the information war, because this is also a war about information. On information, so it's a completely different kind of war, and I would like you to reflect on it. This is point number one. Point number two, you have been talking about demography and how big a challenge it is for not only for Ukraine but also for Russia. But observing the consequences of the war in Poland, we observe mostly mothers with children arriving and staying, and not only in Poland but also in other countries west of Ukraine. And the startling conclusion is that Ukraine is a country which is which now has a lot fewer children that it actually used to have. So it's a country from which half of the children actually left. And what might be the consequences of that?
Okay, with regard to information, let me be quick. One of the things that helps Ukraine to withstand the information war is generally a low level of trust that Ukrainians have towards anything they encounter. And this low level of trust, whereas it's poisoning the relations between the citizen and the state, the citizen and another citizen, at the same time, it makes Ukraine more resilient. I would also talk here that this is not only about information, but what we very often see, what manifests itself as information war is actually the cultural war. Or I would even go further, a religious war. One of the things that sociologists see in Ukraine and in Russia is that communism would probably be more correctly interpreted, especially in the later period of the Soviet Union and in its merging with the orthodoxy, state orthodoxy of Russia, as a religion, not as ideology. So communism in Soviet Union was practiced as a religion, not as ideology. And this is also a contributing factor. This is why monuments are so important. They are religious sacred symbols. They basically are symbols that explain how social order works. And that's why Ukrainians have been taking them down and the Russians have been putting them back. With regards to demography, I think the situation today is there, but we do not know how sustainable this situation is. We do not know where the status quo line will be. Ukrainian males are not allowed, between 16 and 60 are not allowed to leave the country by law. Therefore, families that leave, women and children, cannot be reunited. The hypothesis is that once they will be reunited in the West, they will stay there. But on the other hand, it's a question of I think, let me put it this way, it's an interesting experience that a lot of Ukrainians now feel inside the Ukrainian information space. You hear a lot of voices that, wow, living in Ukraine was really comfortable comparing to living in the EU. And a lot of Ukrainians are now feeling that the quality of life that was accessible in Ukraine is much higher than what they can access at this point in countries that they consider more developed. So it's not black and white. But at the same time, I would say that I've gone through the web pages of the ultra-right parties in most European countries where they are present in the political scene, and I have not seen a single anti-Ukrainian position there. My take is that there is this racism factor is present. Ukrainians are comfortable migration for at least for the ultra-right, because it will blend in. And what Ukraine is afraid long-term is that the states will be putting unseen barriers that would prevent people from leaving and going back to Ukraine. Because if we look at the demographic situation through most of these European countries, it's there as well. It's not as there as in Ukraine, but it's also bad. And the racist part of the societies will be supporting importing white Christian migrants versus, I don't know, Syrians or someone else. So this is another important factor. For Ukraine, migration will be the only way to stabilize its demography. And that will bring in the whole set of issues with identity, with culture, with religion. And I think that the mainstream of building a civic identity in Ukraine that allows people like Mustafa Dzhemilev to be Ukrainian, Vakhtang Kipiani to be Ukrainian, people of different religions, people of different backgrounds, I think it's a healthy move, but we'll have to see if that move will be sustainable.
Thank you, Evgen. This was highly interesting. Thank you so much for those introductory remarks. And last but not least, I would like to welcome Christine Okrent and give the floor to Christine. Please join us and share your remarks on the long consequences of the war in Ukraine for Russia, for Ukraine and Belarus with us.
Thank you, Carolina, and thank you to all the participants. Very interesting remarks. So what I'll try and do is just complement what has been said. And I'm quite surprised that no one so far has mentioned the word economy. So I won't go back to the famous Clinton formula. I wouldn't dare. But it's true that I believe that the economic dimension of our exercise this morning is indeed foremost, starting, of course, with the ever growing question about the efficiency of sanctions. Russia has been undergoing Western sanctions for quite some time, even before the invasion of Ukraine. And the question remains, to what extent can these sanctions be efficient? And this very morning, this Monday morning, there is a summit in Brussels to try and persuade, in particular, Hungary, that indeed more sanctions need to be applied, starting, of course, with an embargo on oil. So I think just to start with the impact on the Russian economy, if we're interested in trying to guess the medium and long-term consequences of this huge destabilization and the extraordinary bravery of the Ukrainian people to actually resist what our friend in Kiev has correctly labeled an independence war. To what extent is the Russian economy going to be affected in the long term? The Russian economy is a very primitive economy, relies entirely on raw materials. So if indeed the Western consensus over increasing sanctions and limiting even gradually our dependency in Western Europe upon Russian oil and gas, that will indeed deprive Russia in the long term of its only sources of income. And by the time China can indeed become the alternate buyer, it will require some time. We all remember the pomp that had surrounded the signing of that agreement over gas supplies to China. But of course, the distances are enormous, and the pipeline that is supposed to bring gas to China is not yet finished. And that agreement, if I'm correct, was signed some 5 years ago. So these are all long-term consequences. But it's obvious that if indeed Western consensus remains and indeed increases economic pressure over Russia, it will be an opportunity for China to seize upon some key interests in Russia. And that will obviously affect the overall geo-economic balance or unbalance of the world today. The same economic guessing exercise, of course, applies to Ukraine, which is indeed completely destroyed. And that seems to be one of the main objectives of the Kremlin, to destroy the Ukrainian infrastructure system. And even in the Donbass, which is quite amazing, because if indeed it is in the Kremlin's interest to seize upon the eastern industrial part of Ukraine. They will have to rebuild that as well. And that will require huge investments. But when it comes to rebuilding Ukraine, if we're under the assumption that in a way Russia has already lost the war, as indeed it hasn't won it. I mean, it's one of these very sort of Jesuitic formulas, but I'm afraid it can apply. Ukraine has not won the war, and Ukraine is destroyed. So Ukraine will need even more of a huge investment effort from the West. And that leads us back to the issue, which I believe is not only medium term, it can unfortunately be short term, of Western consensus. Because there's a point where people will ask, what are the end goals? Well, nobody has specified those end goals on the Western side. Certainly not the Biden administration. It has certainly built up an amazing amount of military support to Ukraine. But the end goals, question mark. There have been different statements. Indeed, it was mentioned that the defense minister, Lloyd Austin, when he visited, I think, American military bases in Poland, said, oh, we need to weaken Russia. Well, that was a very candid and probably very sincere comment, but there was some kind of embarrassment in Washington afterwards. But nothing ever since. So what are the end goals in Washington? What are the end goals among Western allies of NATO? What are the end goals among the 27 EU members? And that is, I think, going to be a growing concern because we also are democracies. And there comes a moment where, to get back to the economy, the economic impact of the whole destabilization of our continent, not only on energy, but on food, the more so as inflation has picked up. What people are worried about in our countries, and I'm more to the west of Europe than you all are, people's concerns have to do with, and I know it sounds petty, but that's what daily life is about. It's how to pay for basic items for their daily lives, from getting their car running to meeting ends meet at the supermarket. So I would only try and insist on the economic dimension of what this whole issue about the war in Ukraine is bringing us. One word about migrations. I think it's quite admirable and moving to see that so many Ukrainians want to go back to their country, want to go back to their homes. And of course, that raises the point that you, Caroline, raised. What about those children? What about those women? And what can be done to protect them and eventually help them go back, assuming, again, there's enough of an effort to rebuild Ukraine. And I think that is the big question mark. How long will the extraordinary miracle that we owe to Mr. Putin, that indeed we feel in the West that we are unified? That hasn't happened for quite some time. How long will that consensus remain? How long can our own democratic systems sustain that consensus, given indeed the wave of populism that is flooding through our system, starting, of course, with American democracy, which frankly is in a rather pitiful state. And coming the midterms elections, and even the nightmare of having Donald Trump run again in 2024, that's indeed medium term. And so how can we prepare for such a shock if indeed that man comes back? What happens to NATO? Well, he just wanted to get out. What happens to the consensus towards the Kremlin? You know, he thought Putin was such a nice guy. So again, I think we have to insist upon the need to build up all the arguments in the medium term for us in the West, however different, however contradictory our own interests, political, economic, identity-wise may be, we have to insist on building up that unity. And that gets us back to the issue of the Ukrainian membership to the EU and also to NATO. Because whatever happens, geography eventually takes over. And geography imposes upon us, and you know that so well in Poland, that Russia will remain our neighbor. And so indeed, without getting into any sort of, compromise at this stage, but we will eventually have to think, how do we sustain some kind of relationship with the Kremlin, whether it's Mr. Putin or somebody else? And I fully subscribe to this idea that, okay, let's get rid of Putin. That would be a miracle. But, the system being what it is, and unfortunately, the Russian tradition of autocracy being what it is, we have to prepare for any kind of worst case scenario. So indeed, and that will be my ending remark, we have to make all sorts of cautionary measures to keep that consensus as strong as possible and not raise at this stage except promises, any concrete issues about getting into NATO or getting into the EU, because that's a very divisive issue at this stage. Not all 27 EU members agree upon the need to get Ukraine into the EU. I mean, there are very different views, hypocritical or not, and not so much about the principle, but about the calendar. What does it mean? And that gets us back to, do we talk medium term? Do we talk long term? Let's remember that there are several countries in the Western Balkans that have been waiting for 8 years already at the door of the EU. It's not a simple issue, even if, of course, politically, symbolically, I, for one, believe we should indeed open our arms to Ukraine to join the EU. NATO is even a more difficult issue. And it was interesting to remember that indeed President Zelensky, if my memory is correct, offered not to ask for NATO membership, at least in the short term. So I will leave it there for the moment, but I would insist again on the necessity to keep Western consensus as long as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christine. And I would just like to have a small follow-up question, because from what you have been saying, The problem of definition is one of the biggest problems, namely that the only country which has its end goal defined is Russia. The rest of the countries that are opposing Russia do not have their end goal defined. This is what I basically have as a conclusion from what you have been saying. And the question is it at all possible that those countries in Europe, that the US, that they do define an end goal?
Well, I think paradoxically, it's more useful for Ukraine that these end goals are not defined at this stage, because that's where indeed disagreements would be out in the open. I think these end goals, however unprecise, will obviously not be the same. And even between the Biden administration and its Western European allies, not even to mention Turkey, there will indeed be disagreements. And I think that's part of the issue of not getting any more precise on those.